Thanks for joining us in this event, which is part of the Agriculture Advantage series that we're organizing and focusing on sustainable land and water management. Is sustainable land and water management compatible with small-scale farming under climate change? So my name is Dinesh. I work for the CGI research program on climate change, agriculture, and food security. I will be moderating this session, which is being jointly organized by CCAFs and led by the International Potato Center and the International Water Management Institute, the World Farmer Organization, and CGI's research program on roots, tubers, and bananas as well. So how the program is structured, for those who haven't seen it, is we start with welcome remarks from my colleague Giriraj Amarnath on behalf of the organizers. And then we have a set of presentations, which there will be opportunities for follow-up questions, 1 or 2 questions for each presentation, and then they will have 20 minutes, 25 minutes for moderated Q&A with the audience, and we look forward to your participation on that. So that's how the program is structured, and we'll have some final remarks and wrap-up as well from me. So without much further wait, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Giriraj Amarnath, who is from the International Water Management Institute, where he leads the research group on water risks and disasters. He specializes in the monitoring of floods and droughts, rapid emergency response mapping, remote sensing data, and image processing, GIS, and a number of other issues at the EME, and who's doing a lot of important work. So over to you, Giriraj.
Thank you, Dhanush. And while Dhanush briefed about the agriculture advantage, what CGR and other partners are looking at, this particular series of side event is looking at land and water advantage challenges around compatible small-scale farming systems in Asia and Africa. And we have got a good set of speakers here from different parts of the region. One is looking at how non-GMO crops are affordable for small-scale farmers, which is led by Jan Low. And we have Alon Nicole, who is looking at agriculture water management solutions. We have brought up a series of solutions that are affordable and can be useful and can be implemented by the farmers itself with the enabling policies that are available. And we have a speaker from African Development Bank, from James Kinyangi, who is also having excellent experience from CJR on the climate change, agriculture, and food security, who is looking at how do we implement with the member states in Africa and elsewhere. And the aspects of from Theo D. Zager from the World Farmers Organization. Some of you have attended the previous event as well, who is looking at the farmers' rights and a well-known author and speaker for this particular talk on land and water advantage. And we have simplified very clear objectives what we are looking at this side event. One is looking at how conditions are favorable for land and water management, for sustainable environments that are affordable for farmers in Asia and Africa. The other aspect what we are looking at, having all the successful tools and techniques that are available, irrespective of biotechnology or agriculture water management solution, how far we can reach that to the smallholder farmers. And without further delay, I would like to initiate the process of having the speakers on board for this session. And I would call upon now the first presentation from Jan Low, who will talk on whether non-GMO climate-smart crops can sustain small-scale farming, drawing for her experience in Africa with sweet potato as a major research, and which is a profit for health initiative at the International Potato Center. Now over to you, Jan Low.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Very good to see all of you here. And today I'm going to address the issue of can non-GMO climate-smart crops alone sustain small-scale farming. I'm with the International Potato Center based in our Nairobi office. The quick answer, of course, is no. Crops always must be in combination with good soil fertility management, access, which I consider access to organic and inorganic nutrient supplies, better water management, and small-scale farmers must have an enabling environment that provides them access to knowledge and markets. And I think we have a great panel today that covers some of the aspects of the enabling environment, as well as a few limited technologies to talk about. Obviously, as we saw in the session on Monday, it's very complex to address all issues, so we're focusing on a few topics to discuss today in this area. And so to adapt to climate change, we need, in the breeding standpoint, to produce more adapted crops faster and at times under tougher conditions. We need to produce more with less water, as we recognize that landholding size, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, is declining significantly over time per capita. And for us at the International Potato Center, it's not just about yields, it's about quality. We're very concerned with the micronutrient content of plants as we improve yields. And that becomes an issue. There was a recent paper out on how CO2 increases often encourage yield improvements, and at the same time we see mineral densities declining. So paying attention to quality as we look to increase in yields is really critical in the agricultural sector. So what does this mean for breeding? And when we're looking at breeding in the context of climate change, we have to downscale climate change models and crop modeling and figure out what are these drivers behind yield and quality loss due to the changing conditions. And that means that breeding programs need to look at new methods. This does take considerable resources because breeding is a numbers game. We start with large numbers of potential varieties and have to work down over the years to get to the few that meet all the various conditions and traits that a crop needs to be successful in different agroecologies. We need cheaper and faster tools to assess progress. And we need a better understanding of the crop. There's been heavy investment over the years. We now, for example, have a full genome of many of the staple foods and are working on genome discovery on the remaining ones. And it means we also have to do a lot more work at the higher end on understanding the physiology and biochemistry behind the different crops. I'm going to focus today, because I'm with the International Potato Center, on roots and tubers in the context of climate change. And there was a World Bank report that came out in 2016 that pointed out the obvious, that climate change and more difficult conditions will lead to increased food prices. Obviously, increased food prices affect the poor the worst and contribute to extreme poverty. And it also showed how per capita demand for roots and tubers in sub-Saharan Africa by 2050 will be significantly higher for roots and tubers than for cereals. And we feel that the technological change in roots and tubers is going to be essential to dampen food price increases and the risk of hunger under any climate change scenario. So the Roots, Tubers, and Bananas program also works on bananas, but these are the key roots and tubers that are being worked on under the CGIAR Roots, Tubers, and Bananas program. And today I'm focusing on the ones I know best, sweet potato and potato. Why am I focusing on these? Well, particularly because I think they're really important crops as we look at the challenging conditions in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the area I know best. And 95% of sweet potatoes and potatoes are grown on small farms in sub-Saharan Africa. And what's interesting, if you look at the data and area expansion under staple foods, the fastest area expansion in sub-Saharan Africa are in potato and sweet potato since 1990. And that's because these crops produce higher energy output per unit area, per unit time. Just to give an example, your sweet potato can produce 194 megajoules per hectare per day, and the maize, compared to maize, which is 145 megajoules per hectare per day. Now, obviously, these are just average figures, and there's a lot of variation, but that's the key point. So when we breed for small farms, we're breeding for yield and pest resistance, especially viruses, which enable farmers to retain their own planting material longer without yield decline. Pest-resistant varieties to decline, we want to see a decline in pesticide use. And for a crop like sweet potato, since farmers usually don't use fertilizer on them, we conduct our trials without fertilizer. Our focus is really on drought and heat tolerance in these crops, and we've aimed through our conventional breeding programs to really address vitamin A deficiency problems with enriched beta-carotene sweet potato, and iron and zinc in potato, and iron in orange flesh sweet potato. And of course, all these need to have good taste and market demand, or they will not be accepted by farmers. Our case in Mozambique, my colleague Maria Andrade is shown here. Breeding for drought has been particularly complex because you need various features like being able for the roots to sprout after the dry season for it to be accepted in the farming systems. We use new technologies like the near-infrared spectrometer, which permits us at 2 minutes per sample to get protein, dry matter, sugars, beta-carotene, calcium, and rough iron and zinc readings. So we can select for quality as we're selecting for higher yields. And we've taken and developed an accelerated breeding scheme, which basically means having more sites earlier in the breeding process. And that's enabled us to reduce the cycle from crossing parents to getting new varieties from 8 to 4 years. We had 15 drought-tolerant orange flesh sweet potato varieties released in 2011 and 7 more in 2016. And a lot of this is with farmer involvement from the advanced yield trial stage onwards. And we're seeing genetic gains with this just improved conventional breeding scheme of 0.3 tons per hectare per year. So we can do a lot with these conventional techniques. The sweet potato program has been particularly interesting because it took a lot to get it off the ground because it was a neglected crop in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly because it was seen as the crop of the poor. And we needed to be breeding in Africa for Africa because introduced materials from other countries often succumb to the very strong virus pressures in East Africa that are different viruses. We have 2 sub-Saharan African countries breeding in 2005 and 13 in 2017, and 3 SIP-led population development programs. So we're very proud of building this breeding capacity aligned with our partners in sub-Saharan Africa, and we have focused because of climate change and because of farmer demand on early maturing varieties. So 40 of the 71 released varieties for sweet potato mature in less than 4 months. There's no point in breeding if it doesn't reach farmers, so we launched the Sweet Potato for Profit and Health Initiative that reached 4.2 million households by September 2017, and our goal is to reach 10 million by 2020. In the Andes, switching to potatoes, we have a microcosm for studying climate change, and this is where we really build on the amazing biodiversity we have in the germplasm bank and with local farmers working together cultivating around 3,000 land races to preserve that biodiversity. We're studying the altitude gradient and learning how the pressure and the increasing temperature is pushing potato production up the mountains to avoid disease problems. Actually, yields go up in some of the lower altitudes, but the pest problems go up in the lower altitudes. And quality is affected we see lower dry matter contents with increasing heat. So our focus on potato really has been breeding for this heat tolerance. And now we have both sweet potatoes and potatoes at 90 days. And this is very good for intercropping with the cereals. And we're almost on the verge of having a 70-day potato variety that is adequately yielding. And this will be able for us to enter into rotation schemes in many different agroecologies. Again, this is all conventional breeding. However, we do have the difficult problem of late blight. You will know late blight from the Irish potato famine. That's what caused the massive outmigration to the Americas and the death of more than 1 million people in Ireland. And late blight severity has been a problem. We've done a lot of conventional breeding and haven't gotten to the point we needed of having varieties that last for years. And so here we've been using a transgenic approach because we see by 1990, you can see the late blight problem will shift in different countries, but in places like Ethiopia, this would require increasing frequency of fungicide application from once a month to once a week. And so here we've been using an approach where we've stacked 3 different resistant R genes into a popular variety known as Victorian Uganda. This is work done in Uganda, and we have very promising results in confined field trials. And this will mean that people will not have to spray with fungicides. One last slide. I'm already out of time. Our modern toolbox is expanding, and new gene editing techniques move away from needing foreign organisms to introduce traits. And I'm sure many of you have heard of the CRISPR-Cas system that's come online, and people are using it in various ways. And what it is, to describe it there, I put a little video up here that you can watch on YouTube to get a more in-detailed description, but I would describe it as using your word program for precise searching for the piece of DNA that you want to modify or eliminate or replace, and then being able to edit, either delete or put in new materials. And you can remove junk. So any foreign organism you put in, you can take out. It can introduce many genetic changes at once. And what I think is very interesting and good about this technology, it's much, much cheaper than other approaches that have been used in transgenics. And that means that we can have more public sector research, more nonprofit research, hopefully for faster outcomes, and hopefully for more pro-poor small farmer outcomes. So I will end there, and I'm sorry for taking the extra minute. Many thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Jan. That was a very interesting presentation, and I've certainly learned a lot more about breeding and the advances of breeding in response to the land challenge. And I must mention that for her work around the Sweet Potato for Profit initiative, Jan received the World Food Prize last year together with other colleagues at SIP. So now we'll open the floor for two pressing questions. Keep it please directly relevant to the presentation, because there will be other time for discussion where you can also share your views on the topic. So two questions from the floor in response to Jan's presentation. Please raise your hands and also introduce yourself when you're making the questions. Can I take it that there are no questions? Yes, there is a gentleman there.
I wasn't going to ask the question, but seeing as no one wanted, it just begs the question, doesn't it? There would be an opportunity to make a lot of progress without, I mean, you put it in the title. Is it necessary for non-GMO? And it seems to me, from what you've shown, it is possible to do an enormous amount without the controversial GMO techniques, which require, which mean that we sort of probably neglect the precautionary principle.
Please introduce yourself.
Apologies, yeah, Chris Henderson from Practical Action.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris, for that question. I think there is a tremendous amount we do with conventional breeding, and because of I think the legal environment, we make great progress in an easier way. And we firmly believe that whatever we can do conventionally, we should do conventionally. When we get to these very difficult issues where conventional breeding is not giving us the results we need, in terms, particularly in pest resistance, then I think we have to look at the modern toolbox, because these are serious problems that farmers face and the world faces in terms of preventing another Irish famine, for instance. This is a serious disease. So I think that's where we have to have the balance and the discussion about when each tool is appropriate to use.
Thank you, Jen. I think that's very helpful, and maybe we can come back to this a bit more during the discussion. Just to be on time, I want to move forward with our next presentation, which is on the other challenge that farmers, small-scale farmers face on water issues. So what are the innovations in water management for agriculture? What are the new pathways and future challenges as well? And this presentation is being made by Alan Nicol, who is a strategic program leader leading the program on promoting sustainable growth at the International Water Management Institute. Alan has more than 20 years of experience in research, policy, consulting, and program development across Asia, Africa, and Middle East. So over to you, Alan, and I hope we can learn a bit from your experience.
Yeah, I hope so too. Let's see. So thank you very much. I mean, my answer to the question is actually yes, but. You answered no. I answer it by saying yes, but. I think there are ways, I think there are important ways in which the smallholder farming world can remain compatible with the challenges of climate change and climate resilience. But I think so much needs to be done. And I think across this panel here, I'm sure there are enough ideas to bring together to tackle some of those challenges. So I would say yes, but that's my kind of opening gambit. So I'll say a little bit about innovations in water management for agriculture, something on new pathways and thinking about future challenges, really trying to understand ways in which the various technologies, techniques and approaches that are available out there can be brought to this very serious challenge. I head up this Sustainable Growth Programme based in Addis Ababa, a country which is regularly suffering from very serious climate events and a very regular problem of rainfall, managing rain-fed agriculture and introducing new forms of irrigation into those systems is one of the key challenges in Ethiopia at present. So looking back very quickly, some of the wider challenges, the stresses out there, we know we need to produce 60% more food by 2050. And there's no surprise that water and managing water within these smallholder systems is such a central piece of that puzzle, how to do it. So 10 years ago in 2007, many of you will have seen this Water for Food, Water for Life comprehensive assessment on water management in agriculture. And it really hammered home the point that the 70% of water, at least, that's used in agriculture is a 70% under enormous pressure, not just from farmers to produce more food, but also from other users. So, one of those key stresses out there for smallholder farmers as they seek more water to bring into their farming systems are the trade-offs with other users upstream and also sharing aquifers. So, the key points that came out of that report are still extremely relevant and very important. And IMI is taking forward analysis of the 2007 report and hopefully bringing to the World Water Forum next year a further rendition of understanding around water for agriculture. So that's just to highlight the nature of the stress. The stress surrounding water for smallholder farmers is a stress shared by all, in short. So we know that managing agricultural water availability, access and use is so critical. We also know that in countries like India, where we do much work with smallholder farmers, something like 50% of the irrigated area is watered by pumps that they themselves have brought into their production systems. So the farmer, the end user, the beneficiary as well of policies and options for smallholder irrigation are very much central to this feature. I was in another session earlier where we were told this is very much a human challenge, and in many cases managing smallholder farming is essentially about human behavior and human decision making. So bringing pump technology into your farming systems is a very individual challenge, a very strong challenge at the household economy level. We also know in much of Africa that the agricultural water management, public irrigation systems are really failing in a way that private systems perhaps aren't failing. There are ways in which public and private management of risk surrounding water for smallholder farmers isn't really very balanced. There's major challenge there for investment, public investment, and finding ways of supporting farmers to manage the publicness versus the privateness of the risk involved. And I mentioned Ethiopia, where so much of the challenges is at the feet of farmers and at their decision-making level. So really understanding the reliance on technologies and the ways in which farmers will manage risk themselves, the privateness of that risk is key. There you'll see a graph where you'll see only 11,000 farmers in Ghana, for example, may be using public irrigation systems to irrigate 7,000 hectares, but a huge number, well over 300,000, irrigating over 60,000, carrying water themselves, a very personal effort to irrigate their lands. What does this mean in practice? It's a personal challenge, it's a household challenge, it's a farmer challenge. What to do about it? Well, it's really something about blending technical innovations and developments. Those kinds of simple, very often quite cheap, not very expensive actions, including small reservoirs, pump irrigation technologies, and also rainwater harvesting, understanding how you can enhance groundwater, you can recharge the soil water profile with much more effective rainwater harvesting techniques, and river diversions in small catchments as well. Major challenges, major opportunities there to improve water management at a small household level. But quite often these technologies founder because they aren't embedded in the right social and institutional environments, particularly relating to things like gender equity, bringing in those groups and those individuals who are the purveyors of new ideas and new technologies and innovation, but often aren't included sufficiently in the programs to support smallholder farmers. So it's a blend really of technological innovations with gender equity and social inclusion that's critical. There you have a photo, for instance, of farmers receiving microcredit, emphasizing the importance that access to finance is just as important as access to new technologies. A few examples, well, solar energy in India, the energy environment relating to the water environment, they're so closely bound together, but we've been working with farmers there to understand how solar pumping can benefit farmers, can generate more water availability to prevent shocks and to reduce the unevenness of water availability, but to prevent over-pumping, and this is a critical issue with the introduction of new technologies like solar pumping, also linking it up to the grid system in India so that farmers can sell their energy back into the grid and make money as producers of energy as well as producers of crops. Managing that trade-off between producing energy for the grid and energy for pumping, of course, a very price-sensitive issue, but an opportunity there to try and scale up this kind of approach to make farmers and their energy production more multi-purpose. Pathway 2, in Ethiopia, taking forward the solar pumping again, where it's feasible, where it can really be suitable for particular farming systems. It involves a number of different factors: access to markets, understanding of how to use it effectively across different growing seasons for different crops. So we've been mapping where that kind of technology is most suitable given the different market conditions, the soil conditions, and the value chains that exist. The challenges remain of difficult regulation, difficult incentive structures to enable or support farmers to pick up on solar technologies. And really one of those chief problems that still exist at many levels in rural areas, both in sub-Saharan Africa but also South Asia, is access to finance for farmers. Sometimes the collateral they need to take out a loan isn't available. But in Ethiopia, we're trying to build a bigger picture of how this technology is going to be useful or perhaps challenging in different environments to inform policymakers. So there's one thing that you could say about solar energy and solar power is it's not going to go away, certainly with respect to farming and irrigation water management for smallholders. So it's very important to govern and understand that environment very carefully. Another pathway, rainwater harvesting, of course, in parts of India, this has been practiced for centuries, probably millennia. And, it's still a technology, one of those simple technologies that has enormous benefits. Again, we've been looking at its introduction in different community environments in parts of India. And lastly, pathway 3 is really about understanding how to use water, how to use the water that you do have available more effectively in your irrigation schemes, looking at this use of a new technology called wetting front indicators, which literally pops up and indicates when there's suitable water in the soil, therefore you need to add no more. So there's a way of actually managing the demand and understanding what's happening below the soil profile to avoid over-irrigation, to avoid the problems of salinity or tail-ended challenges where water isn't available in furrow irrigation systems. And finally, pathway 4, it's also understanding the water picture at scale. So really looking at the use of remotely sensed data and ground truthing that data and bringing it together. And Imi's been working in South Asia on drought monitoring and hazard mapping, trying to understand risk in its many different facets in relation to farming systems, and using that at scale to inform policy, to inform the kinds of investment decisions being made by government, linked to, for example, issues like index-based flood insurance. So trying to find ways of bringing the private sector into helping farmers manage water more effectively, and to also mitigate the impacts of very poor seasons and poor rainfall on farmers through flood insurance. So finally, I think I have 30 seconds left. Yes, time over, 30 seconds. Well, it's really about blending, I would say, water-smart agricultural techniques and approaches, technologies, but also the social and institutional environments in which those technologies are situated into climate-smart agriculture. So, an essential part of climate smart agriculture has to be this notion of water smart, doing it more effectively, managing it more effectively, using the right technologies in the right places, using the combination of soil and water conservation with new technologies to abstract and use water. I would say, if you look at the wash sector, my last point, they've been hugely successful in selling water and sanitation and hygiene for governments, for preventing health challenges in communities around the world. So in a way, the agricultural water sector needs to try and do the same for water management and agriculture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. That was very interesting presentation, and I noted that point around blending. And I think our next speaker can speak a bit more about the other dimension around farmer behavior, which you mentioned. But over to the floor, if there are any pressing questions to Alan. We can take up to 2 questions if there are any. Yes, please.
Hello. Can you hear me now? Yes. Adnan Mirhanoğlu from Save the Tigris River campaign. My question is actually about the issue about the transboundary water issue, because this small-scale farmers is also directly affected by the policies that is governed by the countries. So what do you think about this transboundary water issue? And secondly, about the groundwater usage. Actually, I'm also doing my master on groundwater fed irrigation. And do you think that by using this groundwater is really effective? Because when we think the sustainability issue, actually this is our future generations' reservoir. And if we also use groundwater, so what will be done in the next, after 20 years or 50 years? So I think that in order to save our water for future, we shouldn't use groundwater so much. And the technology should be related with the other issues, not using groundwater so much. Thank you very much.
Is there a second question? Okay, so Alan, maybe you can respond to this.
Adnan, thank you. Yeah, well, I mean, every river basin is composed of catchments, microcatchments, a whole system of water. It's one system, effectively. So, yes, anything that happens in one part of the basin potentially can have impacts downstream, right? So, in any large-scale development of agriculture in a shared river basin, whether it's just within one country, across states, or between states, account should be taken of upstream and downstream usage. There are protocols in international law surrounding these issues that help guide people making large-scale decisions on irrigation, for example, in farming systems. But, your point is well taken. When you look at the Nile Basin, where I do a lot of work, you'll see people talk about the water in the system being X amount. But if you look at the amount of rainfall that falls in the same basin, it's increased by thousands, by multiple of 7,000 billion cubic meters of water versus 100 billion cubic meters of water in the river itself versus the rainfall. So there are big challenges there in managing, what we understand by the water availability in a particular basin as well. But your point is well taken. The second point, yes, I mean, groundwater should be used advisedly. It's not a free resource, firstly. It's a public resource in many cases. It's quite easily polluted. Look at the debates on fracking going on around the world at the moment. So it's one that should be managed very carefully, but that requires monitoring. And it's a hidden resource, so it's actually difficult to monitor. So, bring in the precautionary principle on groundwater, absolutely, I would say.
Thank you, Alan. So we'll move on to the next presentation, which would focus on the most important dimension as part of this addressing these land and water challenges on the farmer dimension, and mechanisms to organize farmers and protect land rights. And the speaker for speaking to this topic is Theo De Jager, who's the president of the World Farmer Organization. He's also the president of the Southern African Confederation of Agriculture Unions. He was the former president of the Pan-African Farmers Organization as well. And I actually went to him with his bio note, and he has a PhD in philosophy, and he's also a political scientist. And I asked him, is it correct? And he told me, yes, that's exactly what you do in farming. So over to you, Theo, for the farmer perspective, the philosopher perspective, and the political scientist perspective.
Thank you. When you farm livestock, every farmer knows exactly what the carrying capacity of his land is. If you don't know that, if you overgraze, you cause a lot of damage to your land. It can even be permanent damage if you do it for too long. When farmers discuss the issue of land and water and the scarcity of it, the first question that comes to mind is, what exactly is the carrying capacity of this planet? How many mouths can you feed from this planet? And when will we get to that number? Already, in vast areas on the globe, we are really stretched out in terms of the availability of water. And it's not about, or not only about how much water is available, it's also about the quality of the water that is available. The previous speaker referred to the competition for water. I've been in parts of Africa where mining activity and agriculture is really knocking heads. Not only because mining takes up a lot of water that previously went to agriculture, but also about what mining is doing to the quality of the water that is available. And it's not only from the source, it is also in terms of the rain. We've seen acid rain, for example, in the Congo Basin and in the Elephants River Basin, where farmers had to change what they are farming with because of a drop in weaning percentages of their livestock. Now, land and water is the absolute nexus in agriculture. There's no agriculture without land and water. You at least need those two. You can go in hydroponics with water only, and of course the nutrition you need for the plants. But you cannot go with land only without the water. A number of countries in the global south have started to complain that agriculture takes up too much water. I think in my neck of the woods in southern Africa, they say agriculture uses 36% of the available water sources. And they are even talking of the possibility to import water or to view it as virtual water in certain crops like bananas, which is one of the most thirsty crops you can farm with. Average banana tree uses 90 liters of water per day. So the question is, shouldn't one rather import that kind of commodities from areas with more water? You know, from the farmer's perspective, we these days put much higher value on those natural resources where you have certainty of the use. No use that you have access to land if you are uncertain whether you will be still around in a year or two, simply because unlocking the wealth in land and water requires investment. There are smart ways of using water and land because of new technologies, but that new technologies cost a lot of money. And capital is as shy as a deer. You scare it and it runs. The poorest farmers in the world, those in Africa and elsewhere in the global south, simply do not have access to the financing. Mostly because they do not own the land on which they are, and they do not have secured water rights. If that is not secure, there is no investment. No one will buy the kind of technology or irrigation equipment or the smart water use technology if you are not certain that you will be there to harvest the crop. This is all about the way land and water is governed, and governance is the Achilles heel for the poorest farmers. That's why there is such a push, more from women farmers, which in Africa It's the majority of the real producers, and from anyone else. To have certainty, to know that the water you develop can be used again next year and the year after, because you have a secured right. There is such a close connection between the governance of land and water, not necessarily the cost, that too, but the governance of it, the certainty around it, and the output in production. That is actually what separates those who make it in farming as a business from those who are simply eking out a living from the soil. And really, we do not have enough space on the globe to continue with this notion of poor peasant farmers who are not producing surpluses, who are caught in a poverty trap because of the way they are farming. I've recently traveled through Sudan to Egypt, and I was fascinated by the technology I saw, ox-driven plow. I must have taken about 50 photographs of this plow with no metal in it. It was made all of wood. And 2 hours later, I saw a farmer bringing a similar implement out of the field, and he put it right next to the road. And I must have taken 100 photographs of this, the craftsmanship that went into making this implement. You know what? 2 days later, I was in Cairo, in the Cairo Museum. I saw exactly the same implement. 3,000 years old. Nothing has changed. That is why farmers are caught up in this poverty trap. There is no new technology. Nothing has evolved from where they were. The irrigation is all still flood irrigation, if there is any irrigation at all. Now compare that to drip irrigation or micro irrigation. Climate smart ways of utilizing, getting the maximum out of every drop. A next generation will simply not be able to do this anymore, because there's only that much land and that much water available on this planet. So it asks from us to plan around what we have, to ask what is the best way to utilize these. And it all starts with the certainty. No one is going to invest in a plan without the certainty of use. It also means that we need to change the way we have been doing things up to now. Many of that has been done under the stamp of culture. It is culture to farm with 3,000 head of cattle without ever slaughtering or selling any of it. It is culture to have all the land in the hands of a tribal chief, and there is no rights to the women who are actually working it. Well, culture is also a living thing. It needs to change, it needs to grow, it needs to evolve. And it's time that we address these holy cows, tackle them by the horns, and wrestle them to the ground. Because we can make more of any of the other technologies, but we cannot make more water or more land. We are stuck with what we have.
Thank you, Theo. For those really compelling remarks. I mean, touching on the governance issues and the planetary boundaries, but also looking at the next generation of farmers, which is also something which we need to consider. And in the context of what you said, has things really changed from your visit from Sudan and on your way to Egypt? So some very important points, and you also touched upon the issue of unlocking finance, which farmers can access, and perhaps that's what our next speaker will touch upon. But before we go to that, are there any questions to Theo from the floor? Yes, please. And please also introduce yourself before asking a question. The lady over here in the second row.
Okay, my name is Patience Magodo from Zimbabwe. I'm a community developer into social banking. What's lacking is to the poorest of the poor, we know, like what you spoke about, farming as a business. We need a holistic and an integrated approach when we go to farmers. Because you find you come with these water issues, you come with breeding and seed varieties, and then you come with something. But certain things that are simple, like water harvesting techniques, we haven't seen them being introduced in sub-Saharan Africa. And we're talking of climate change and environment management. I think money is coming in, is going to the poor, but it does not leave anything that is sustainable. So at the end of the day, I think we need to have like a holistic approach to everything. You come with good seed, you coming with water, you coming with farming as a business and water management. But all of you are still investing. But for years, we have not received anything. Like now, I'm a social banker. We want those that are not banked to be banked. If it was a company, I would need a lot of expertise on one farm. But as you go, you are going as different silos. So the farmer will receive a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of that. But if it's not put together, poverty will not go away. She spoke about potatoes, but we haven't seen processing of sweet potatoes. We still see them being marketed on the roadside. And we're speaking about women. So the technology, for as long as you are not integrating it so that somebody has everything that they need to farm and to take poverty out, we'll still have problems. So what I ask of you is, at the end of the day, I was a risk officer. I would look at all the expertise that I need for a business to work. So come together, go even to one community and give them an integrated, holistic solution. At the end of the day, then we have pilots to take to, because sub-Saharan Africa, the food wastage is above 60%, but we still talk of hunger. So I think at the end of the day, money is being spent. To me, at the end of the day, it's wasted, because if you give me good seed, but I don't have the technology, I will remain poor. And I'm speaking of women who constitute about 77% of farmers in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. That's an important comment about holistic approaches, which breaks down to silos. Theo, do you want to make any further remarks on that? On how we can break silos?
Please, it is, Zimbabwe is very close to my heart. I still have family. They are no longer farmers, but, you know, that country on its own can feed the whole of Southern Africa. We can use a bag of Zimbabwean soil as fertilizer in the area where I farm. It's got all the land, it's got all the water, it's got all the people. The human capital that comes from that country is superior to any of its neighbors. What is lacking there is the investment in the value chains. You see, there's a very good reason why we speak in agriculture of value chains. It's because you cannot push a chain, you can only pull it. And in agriculture, the market is the only pulling force. Farmers will always farm with what they can sell onto the market. And if there's no market, there's poverty. There's only one way to kill the dragon of poverty, and that's by the creation of wealth. And agriculture can do that in a very short space of time. There's no other sector of the economy that can create more wealth in a shorter space of time on a broader basis in Africa than agriculture can do. But then you need a market where you can sell your produce at a profit. There is enough food in Africa. The crisis is that the food is not where the people are hungry. And to get it there, you need investment, you need infrastructure, you need the linkages to the markets. And that is not coming forth because there is not enough certainty, and we do not have the kind of governance that lure investments. Before the investments will come, and it will come by itself, if you have an environment which is conducive to profitable agriculture and profitable business in general. Money is available as long as there is this environment in which it can thrive. In Africa, not only Zimbabwe, my own country, South Africa, Botswana, Mozambique, all of these are rich in natural resources. but poor in business opportunities because of governance issues and because of the certainty you need for good investments.
Thank you, Theo, and that's a good point where we can go into the next presentation, which is about a supporting enabling environment in Africa, including the role of credit and savings, and also touching on many of the issues you mentioned about bringing the resources, the investment, the market linkages, and so on. So we have with us James Kinyangi, who is the Chief Climate Change and Policy Advisor at the African Development Bank. Prior to this, he also worked with me as a colleague with the CGR research program for climate change, agriculture, and food security as the regional program leader for East Africa. So over to you, James.
Yeah. Thank you, Danush, and thank you for inviting me here to this very distinguished panel of colleagues. It's always very difficult to give a talk after Theo has spoken, because Theo is a very strong advocate of the farmers' rights and farmers' needs, and he's made an excellent case for the need why we need this for the reason why we need this integrated approach that brings in not just the ownership element with land and access to water rights, but also really ensures that farmers can have access to finance in order to make those quality decisions about driving agriculture as a business. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to contribute to this debate. I wanted to start by saying, just showing this slide, by saying that, in agreeing with most of my colleagues here, that agriculture remains a major source of income in Africa. However, as you've heard, its untapped potential has resulted in chronic poverty and food insecurity. And I think most of you will know that we're coming out of a difficult period of these recurrent droughts, where we have had food and emergency appeals across many of sub-Saharan Africa's vulnerable lands. Now, if we quickly look at this slide, one, you've had, I think, the narrative that the gap between employment and income is huge in agriculture. Agriculture as a share of GDP, from these 2014 numbers that we see here, if you look at Africa, about 61% of the total employment in agriculture. I think that is high by any measure if you look at the other examples. And up to a quarter of the GDP is being derived from agriculture. I think then you can understand that given the complexities that we're mentioning here, that it becomes an area where we should give much attention. Now, even though you can see that up to 2 in 3 Africans are involved in agriculture, you see still widespread poverty over many of the agroecological zones across Africa. Up to almost 400 million people living on less than $1.25 a day. I mean, that's staggering. And if you look at the relative productivity, and I think, again, this analysis has been done, and you have seen these numbers bandied around, but if you look at the value chain approaches Theo has said, if you look at cassava, less than 1/3 of best practice yields that you find across Africa. Maize, only 2 tons, while other areas in terms of best practice are doing up to 19 tons. And so we see, when we do an analysis at the bank, we see this huge import bill because there's really a gap in the production. But there are other mitigating factors also. Africa is rapidly urbanizing. And, at the rate of about 4% a year, you're going to have 3 times the number of people that we have today, almost 2.5 times actually, the number of people that we have today living in urban areas, if you do those projections up to 2025. And we see that in these urban areas, preferences for agricultural commodities, goods, and services are shifting. And if we take this example from Nigeria, you can see that if you look at the rural area, and if you partition the consumption of premium rice to the standard rice, you see nearly 2/3 of rural Nigeria is consuming standard rice, while the opposite is actually true. if you look at the urban Nigeria, almost 2/3 of urban Nigeria is actually consuming premium grade rice. And so preferences are shifting for agricultural commodities. And I think from Theo's perspective, I think this is encouraging news that it is creating that pull towards the market for opportunities for farmers to produce. Now, again, there's been a strong case made for smallholders moving into the business model. And I would like to say that if you take, again, the value chain approach, and at the bank we are working a lot with financing the value chain approaches, I think you see tremendous business opportunities along the agricultural value chain. There are opportunities in the input industry. I think those of you who were here in the previous presentation before this one, you understood that there was a case being made for investments in fertilizers. That's one of the areas of business that provides for the input, investments in the input industry. You have the primary production with modern farm clusters, with greenhouses, and I think that is being noticed a lot across a lot of sub-Saharan Africa. That's emerging, especially in the urban areas with urban agriculture. You have the first level processing where you have warehousing, that's opportunities again for farmers to invest. You have the second level processing that provides opportunities for investments in the industry and agro-processing and machinery vending, all the way to the distribution and marketing. And so I think smallholder farmers in Africa need not only think about agriculture on the productive side, but they need to be engaged also in the processing, marketing, and the distribution. And it's not all doom and gloom. There's transformation happening. If you look at this graph that tells you that in Kenya has been, within a period of about 10 years, Kenya was able to become a very important player in the horticulture export business. And this was because there was transformation in the way the business model around horticulture and irrigated agriculture, especially with the contract farming approach, with political will to support the smallholder farmer development. In Ethiopia, the floriculture industry is growing there. Tremendous growth in the floriculture industry, with strong government support in infrastructure and logistics, access to land and provision of long-term credit. And just as we saw that previous slide in Nigeria also, there has been this push for business opportunities with registration of farmers for the input subsidies there. And so with the participation of government and with bringing closer those tools of the e-wallet and e-vouchers and e-registration in Nigeria, I think there has been this massive growth in the number of participating farmers there. Now, if we quickly look at the, I was asked to talk about the business environment and the policy environment around transformation of smallholder agriculture across Africa. We see that unsupportive business environment is only one of the barriers to transformation of smallholder agriculture. You have this whole range of barriers along, that affect the underperforming of value chains, insufficient infrastructure, limited access to agricultural finance. The agribusiness environment itself, I think we've had, is very difficult around agriculture, with a lot of risks, and limited inclusivity and growth continues to plague agriculture. But I wanted to say that at the bank we are looking at an environment around 7 enablers to increase productivity with the transformation of technologies and mechanization. We are investing in value addition with post-harvest, reduction of post-harvest losses and the whole investment around agropoles. The hard and software infrastructure, we're looking at agricultural finance, both from the sovereign and non-sovereign operations approach. We are supporting a lot the agribusiness environment with enabling agriculture and land policy initiatives, and a number of other issues around also coordination and supporting the leadership for agriculture effort. Let me just quickly say that one thing that we are also strengthening in terms of our approach and how we work with regional member countries across Africa is we understand supporting the enabling environment in Africa also includes risk management and asset protection, and also the inclusion of women and youth. And I'd like to say that we're working with a number of countries to develop facilities for the risk-sharing mechanisms. We're going to be bringing within the next few years, within the next 5 years or so, greater efforts to lending for women in agriculture, women enterprises in agriculture. And so those are areas where the bank is focusing and leveraging and working with countries. The example here with Uganda, that's going to invest almost $113 million in smallholder productivity, making sure that there's enhancements to production and productivity, but also with infrastructure development and market development and trade facilitation. And the government of Uganda itself is bringing in $11 million for a loan component of $102 million. And this is a model that's replicated all across Africa for many of the countries that are investing in agriculture. So I wanted to finish by saying that there are many opportunities for leveraging financing, for developing co-financing approaches. From development finance institutions, I was very encouraged to hear my sister here who is working on the social financing approaches. I assume this includes also table banking schemes in Zimbabwe. There's opportunities for bringing in multilateral and donor finance, the investment funds and the non-banking finance institutions, but working also with small and large-scale agribusinesses in models that bring in the participation of smallholder farmers. And I would be willing to engage further around those and tell you some of the specific mechanisms that we are undertaking at the bank, and we are also working with member countries to advance. And I think, Danush, I will stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you, James, for this very comprehensive presentation, both outlining the issues, the solutions, what the bank is doing, and ending us on this very positive note around partnerships that is required for this transformation. We can take one or two specific questions with James from the floor. Are there any questions? Yes, please. So there are two questions, Chris and a gentleman in the same row. We'll collect both questions and then, James, you can respond to them both.
Hi, I'm Krug Ganyasulu. I'm an intern with UNFCCC. And first of all, I want to say thanks for all the presentation and especially the just ended presentation. But my question is mostly focused on African Development Bank's investment plan, because most of it is it's designed towards established institutions or government institutions, and I haven't gone through to see where they have like the probability to invest in let's say startups or risky like idea programs that are geared towards climate smart agriculture. So I just want to find out like what are the opportunities or like future plans for African Development Plan towards looking at different ideas that can bring in like certain climate smart innovation agriculture in place. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we just take the second question as well at the corner?
Thank you very much for the presentation. You can see a lot of innovation and drive when it comes to finance, getting the finance out there, seeing finance as a solution. Don't disagree that the investment is needed. We're here in the Climate COP talking about getting financed for adaptation. What worries me is a little bit like the precautionary principle question, is around safeguards and making sure that there's not maladaptation because it's driven by this huge need to make business work, make the business models work. Now we know that for the most vulnerable, for women, for people who are risk adverse, probably the assets they have is their natural capital and their knowledge, their labor and their social groups. We need low cost, risk adverse, low cost or low risk innovations that people can use the assets they've got to step up. And so really what I'm looking for is a marrying of what the bank and the financial institutions offer, the commercial side, and what we know will not lead to maladaptation, that will be accessible. So those safeguards, those sort of quality criteria.
Thank you, Chris. Over to you, James.
Yeah. Thank you for those two questions. I think they're very appropriate questions. And I think I would like to say also my colleague Justice Kabiemera is here, who leads the Climate and Spatial Development Fund at the bank. So Justice, if you have any reactions, you could also take the opportunity to respond. But let me say, for Chris, let me say that in terms of the AFDB investment plans, AFDB, the largest portfolio of AFDB's lending or AFDB's financing is towards sovereign solutions. And so it's directly working with governments. And so a lot of the needs for finance and the priorities are articulated by the governments themselves. And I think AFDB responds in that approach. Now, we have a small part of the portfolio that holds what we call the non-sovereign operations, that brings in the work of the private sector, and a small little part where Justice participates, which is what we call the trust funds, that are targeted towards helping to fill some of the lending gaps. And so in that sense, I think we have a mixed approach that can take into account new and risky opportunities for lending, provided they are framed within the particular instrument, within the particular non-sovereign operation or private sector operation. And I think these are already, the bank is really reaching out to a lot of the I think through the Enable Youth program, I think through the Women and Youth Employment program, I think they're targeting those sorts of very risky ventures to support those. For the gentleman from Practical Action, I think looking towards marrying the innovations in financing and the practicalities of addressing risk. I think what the bank has done recently, and I think I would say in the past they've had much less appetite for that because of the need to protect the assets of the bank. But I think they are much more bold now, and I think what we need is, within the context of the partnership slide that I showed, we need to reach out, because we understand also at the bank that we don't necessarily have all the expertise of assessing the risk that goes with all the social groups that need to tap into the financing instruments that we have. And so we are looking at that expertise being provided by the people that are working on the value chains, the people that are working on the specific technologies themselves, in order to work with the banks, with the commercial financing institutions, to design those low-cost, low-risk type products that the bank can then be advised to invest. And so I think it's a coming together of those communities in understanding what's the risk around those investments, and then advising the bank where to actually put its money. So I think there is opportunity for that going forward. I would say that, Danush.
Thank you, James. It was very helpful. So moving to the next part of this event, and that's really the discussion, where we're really looking forward to your participation there. So we've heard from the research community, we've heard from the investment community, we've heard from the farmer community on the whole issue of sustainable land and water management in the context of climate change. So in this context now, I would like to open the floor. We'll collect a few different questions, maybe around 4 or 5 of them, and then the panel will get the opportunity to respond to them. So I see 2 questions there. We'll take those 2 first, and then next one.
Hi, I'm Travis Frank from Climate Interactive, and we have a decision support tool around climate smart agriculture that tries to look at what different types of technologies and methods and conservation tillage and whatnot that can improve climate smart agriculture and the climate effects. But whether or not you've got better seeds, better genetics, or whether you've got drip irrigation, or whether you've got better finance, one of the things our tool is showing us, and this is sort of a question of whether or not we have the model wrong or something, is something a little bit related to Theo's plow from 3,000 years ago, which is no matter whether you've got the innovations in any of the different parts of the chain, if you don't get the diffusion, you don't see any benefit. So all the research in the world and all the improvements doesn't matter unless the farmers get it. And with smallholder farmers, this topic, it's particularly hard to get it widely adopted. So I was wondering if you could talk about innovations in diffusion and whether that's how you see that problem.
Thank you.
Natalie Bennett, I'm here with the Green Economics Institute, although for the interests of full disclosure, I should perhaps say I used to be the leader of the Green Party of England and Wales, and I'm also a graduate in agriculture from Australia. What we're starting to just grasp in developed world agriculture is that basically we have to shift rapidly to no-till, no pesticide, an entirely different form of farming from the developments that we've seen over the past few decades. I'll cite, for example, the study that people have just started focus on in Germany about insect numbers down 75% in 27 years. There's a real chance, I think, in what we're doing in Africa to avoid all of the mistakes that have been made in developed world agriculture over the past few decades. So are we starting to see that message getting through? That's question one. You might say it's the agroecology approach for shorthand. The other question is thinking about the issues of food security and sustainability and local food supplies. I doubt I'm the only person in the room who winced when you said floriculture. We really need to, I think, on the scale, be talking about local food security, and is that really the focus of what you're doing? Thank you.
Thanks very much. So maybe we move to this side of the room. Are there any questions from the side? Just to get, yes, please. Carl.
Yes, just so I'm Carl. I work with Care International. I just want to pick up on that issue of local food security, and to perhaps, if I could ask the panel to maybe think more about nutrition and health as a driver rather than yield and profit as a driver. So to think downscaling our solutions to address household and community nutrition challenges among small-scale agriculture. And Jan, you touched a particularly emotional, historical chord by referring to the Irish famine. And that's 170 years ago. This year was the worst year of that famine. And of course, a lot of the deaths experienced were because of an over-dependency on a single dietary, basically a complete dependence almost on the potato. So I'm wondering whether you could connect a nutrition answer to the issue of dietary diversity, and how a sweet potato and other roots or tubers or other crops can help diversify the diet and therefore address the nutrition challenge.
Thank you, Carl. There's one question over here.
Xiaoting from International Institute for Environment Development, and also picking up on the earlier question, but the first part on how we avoid mistakes that we made in other parts of the world, and honing in probably on the sustainability part of the land and the water management. So how do you see, we heard a lot about the profit and the market and the scaling up some of the smallholders and the inclusion of them into the market, and agriculture still is one of the biggest sector of climate change emitter of carbon emissions. So besides adaptation, we also need to think about mitigation. And in sub-Saharan Africa, agriculture is the biggest driver of forest deforestation as well. So again, it's have big impact on the land and the ecosystem that in the end actually support a lot of the agriculture and the productivity of it. So how do you see the wonderful solutions here can take into account and be linked into the sustainability bit and avoid the mistakes other countries have made? Thanks.
Thank you. Anything from this side, I want to be inclusive, not excluding anyone. Okay. Any other one? Just to, you've both had chances, so so we have 10 minutes, so we'll go one round, and if there is time, we'll come back to you again. So I just want to give as much opportunity as possible to everyone. So we have 10 minutes. So yes, and there will be refreshments outside, so you'll have opportunities to bring up your questions there as well with the speakers. So we'll start from Theo and go in this order. There is around 10 minutes, and your responses to these questions. So there is a question around diffusion and innovation. There's a question around avoiding the mistakes of the past in conventional agriculture, around nutrition and health being the primary drivers, and the very important question also about mitigation and low emissions development pathways for agriculture. So Theo, maybe you can start and pick on the questions that you found most relevant to yourself.
Thanks. If I maybe can start with the first one on innovations. You know, in Africa, we have leapfrogged from the drum to the smartphone in about 2 decades, 20 years, without having gone through the landline. You can go into the deepest corners of Africa, to the poorest families. They have access to a mobile phone. Today, it is possible to speak to them and to have a response, which was 5 years ago not the case. This opens up wonderful opportunities for the modernization of agriculture, for advocacy, the job of farmers' organizations, and for extension services. Most important, you know, data is the new gold in agriculture. Today we can measure because of mobile technologies. It's very important that farmers retain the ownership of their own data. And when we tackle things like land use and water use, that's where it all starts. You must know what exactly you are dealing with. The GIS pins on the map and the volumes of water. There's this golden principle in agriculture, no matter how big or small you are. But if you cannot measure it, you cannot manage it. But now we can measure because of mobile technology. And even though many farmers, and I know I'm guilty myself because I'm on the wrong side of 50, still shy away from this technology, the youngsters are born with fingers for small buttons, and they understand it. I find that even with my children who are still in school, it is as if they have been born with the ability to utilize this kind of technology on the farm, which means the new generation of farmers out there, and specifically those who I love so much, the young farmers in Africa, they are excited about the applications of the digitalization of everything we do on a farm, whether it is managing your workforce, or whether it is marketing, or whether it is measuring your inputs, or your management of your finances. All of it is really taking a brand new face because of the opportunities that's been opening up. And somehow, I have the impression that my generation of farmers must just step aside and let these youngsters do what they can do with the technology that is available. This leapfrogging opportunities is there for them to utilize. In that sense, my generation is probably but like the Moseses of this world. We will probably see it but not enter it. It is on whether we can give them the leeway to do what the technology can allow them to do now.
Thank you, Theo. Ellen, maybe your remarks.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. Well, Travis, good point you made there. I mean, you can do so much, but, you know, you can have farmer field schools, you can have demonstration plots, you can have champion farmers, you can do the whole shebang, but it can always remain a little pilot in a little country or part of a continent somewhere, and it doesn't get anywhere, even if it's brilliant. So, you know, your point is spot on. I mean, I would argue government has to play a role, local government particularly has to play a role in diffusion of technology. So where countries have not invested in their extension services, where you have serious depletion in the human resources to help farmers understand and apply multiple technologies at a local level, like Uganda, where I spend a lot of time. There are major problems there. There's a gap between knowledge and its application. So it's a governmental responsibility. I hate to say it, but government has to play a large role in this, right? That's one thing. Natalie, your point is absolutely well taken. I was in an agricultural input supplier in northern Uganda just recently. The shelves were full of pesticides and herbicides and other goodies that farmers were liberally applying without the necessary masks and other kind of barrier equipment in their fields in that area. Now the question is, how do you govern the use of these pesticides and herbicides in these farming systems where you have multiple smallholder farmers who are becoming increasingly able to buy their desired herbicides and pesticides without the necessary infrastructure around it. So the nicotinoid issues, all sorts of other issues could be multiplied many times over in Africa and affect groundwater and affect all sorts of communities as a result. So a big challenge there. I don't know what the answer is, but certainly monitoring usage is a critical part in many developing country contexts, and learning lessons from Europe and elsewhere where those lessons are appropriate. Carl, your point on health and nutrition, absolutely. I mean, I think, multi-cropping, mixed crops. I want to make a general point here, if I may, very quickly, in that farmers, practical action, we're talking about securing farmers against risk, or are we talking about generating more value and income so that the future generations want to be farmers, right? So one of the big challenges now in East Africa, where I live, is keeping farmers in farming systems, because keeping them just as smallholder farmers, producing just enough, maybe a little bit more surplus, year on, year out, will not keep young people in farming systems. So they leave. So those farming systems become subject to all sorts of social challenges that then have to be dealt with. So, there's a big question here. The small technologies are great, but somehow there has to be a leap as well. And that's got to be taken into account. And finally, I think, Sadine, was it? You were here. Oh, she's maybe gone out. But there was a point there about carbon capture. Well, the mitigation side of all this smallholder farming has to be, from a water science perspective, increasing the carbon content in soil, getting the humus and other kinds of carbon content into the soil to trap the water, to help manage the soil water profile. It's all linked up. In other words, the adaptation side, the mitigation side is very closely connected, and it has to be managed as such. Next, over to you.
Thank you, Alan. Over to you, Jen.
All great questions. We very much believe, and we've done a lot of work on the integrated, what we would call agriculture, nutrition, marketing model. And I also am concerned that if the emphasis is just on profit making, we often find that in areas with high commercialization of crop X, that's where you find the greatest stunting among young children. But it has to be explicit when you design a program that you are going to be paying attention to household nutrition, and that's a key part of the message that goes out. I love there's a Chinese proverb that every day a family should have 14 ingredients. And if you've ever visited China and gone to a dinner, you count it, and there's usually at least 14. And I think that's a good principle. We do need diversified diets for healthy populations, and that's where I really agree with getting more good water management, because in a lot of these most at-risk areas, one of the reasons that you only have 3 major foods in the diet is because they can't grow the other foods because they don't have enough good management of the resources that are available, or they don't have access to a diverse variety of seeds. So a lot of this is about access. And I must admit, I stay up at night thinking about how can we go to scale? Because it doesn't if we can't breed and we can't get it out there. And so a lot of what we're focusing on through establishing partnerships with others is how to try and get the scale. We have a lot of models, delivery systems we've developed, and this is everybody's biggest challenge. And research on going to scale, learning how to do it effectively. And we see the differences when we work in countries with existing extension systems, even if they're weak. We can make so much more progress than in countries that don't even have extension systems. So we need advocacy with governments to prioritize agriculture as part of the solution. big advocacy. I've come up with the conclusion that one of our key entry points for the future, is building agricultural programs and access to inputs through school systems. A lot of people who don't end up going to the cities are people who complete primary school and then don't go on. We should really have strong programs within the school systems, because primary schools are everywhere, late primary, early secondary. This could be a key training ground for getting information on nutrition in particular and information about new technologies out. And again, we'd have to incentivize the teachers to participate in this and link to local farmer organizations where they exist. But we need new models, because going to scale is our challenge about getting that diffusion. And I do hope we can have a different model of development that keeps small farmers in the system. I would hate to think that with the love of the land that you see in sub-Saharan Africa, that we have a system where only less than 1% of the population is involved in agricultural production. I think we do need to think creatively, but it's all going to depend if we get the governance systems behind it.
Thank you, Jen. James, would you like to?
No, just to quickly say, maybe in 30 seconds, that it's a little bit complicated. I mean, this whole approach with the local food industry, and whether you focus on health or nutrition, and whether you rather focus on yield and profitability, I think there is a fine balance there to work. Because if you look at most of the production systems across Africa, I mean, if you're one of the 300 million that's living on $1.25, on less than $1.25 in the arid and semi-arid lands, the only opportunity you have is maybe to produce livestock or livestock-dominated food products. And if you live in the tree crop systems, then you produce cassava and bananas. And if you live somewhere else where you can grow maize, then you grow maize and beans. And if you live in the sorghum millet-dominated systems, that's what you grow. So you need some form of, if that's what you can produce in that system, two things. You can either modify using technology to grow other things, in which case if you are in the arid and semi-arid environments, you need some form of irrigation so that you can do other crops. If you are in these other systems where, if you are in the humid tropics, where if you grow a crop of beans, it's wiped out by fungal diseases, then you need the more disease-resistant type of bean varieties. And so there has to be some form of exchange in creating those local food industries. There has to be some form of exchange. If the Director General of the International Livestock Research Institute was here, Jimmy Smith, he would have told you that the third fastest growing commodities in terms of demand today across Africa and in the world is meat, milk, and eggs. It's not rice and maize and millet. So, but if you look around, you see that the people that produce livestock in Africa are perhaps the poorest, and those that live in the crop-dominated regions are less poor than the ones that live in the livestock-dominated regions. But he makes the case, a strong case, that the livestock people have commodities that the other people need. And so you need some kind of a market system that is going to facilitate that exchange through business models for smallholder farmers. And so I would say it's a fine balance. You can do it, but I think we need investments both from the science and technology, but also financing and government support.
Thank you, James. So I think we need to conclude now. I was supposed to have 5 minutes to give concluding remarks, but I have 1 minute and 6 seconds, so I'll try to do it very quickly. So the title of this event is a question. Is sustainable land and water management compatible with small-scale farming under climate change? And as Jan started, she said the quick answer is no.
No,
but
I said for my question, not
yeah.
I believe yes.
Yeah. Thank you for correcting me.
Yes.
And then Alan took a different view, and other speakers had different views as well. So in my mind, as I go back, reflect on the presentations and interventions, I don't have an answer. Is it a yes or a no? I think it depends on the context. It depends on a number of different factors, and if we work on these factors appropriately, it is possible to be a yes. And these factors, in my mind, what sticks is certainly the investment dimension, and investing in context, in ways and means which are appropriate to the context at different scales, in those holistic models and not in silos, as the colleague from Flow Zimbabwe pointed out. And there is this whole aspect around leapfrogging, using data and science and research, as Theo pointed out. And we need to remember, we need to be focused on farmers of the future, the young people, the youth, as Theo pointed out again. And that should be the focus. They are going to be the drivers of transformation. And as Alan pointed out, it's not just the technology, it's also the social inclusion, gender aspects. It's about blending different aspects together. And that's going to deliver a yes answer to this question. And for that, we need partnerships, as James had in his concluding slides. And we need those partnerships at scale. And we need them very quickly if we are to achieve this transformation as soon as possible. So I would like you to take a positive message, saying that it could be a yes, and we need all of us to put in our bit towards these partnerships and scale out sustainable land and water management practices with small-scale farmers. Thank you. Now, there are refreshments outside, so I encourage you to go outside and we can have conversations with the speakers and others and discuss some of these solutions and opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you.